Good afternoon, sir. How you doing? And can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Doornbosch. I'm the president of the Central Bank of Curaçao in Sint Maarten. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure.
Okay, great. One of the things I would like to kind of focus on is, of course, there are many conversations as to what the central bank does. Recently, you guys were in Parliament, but I think it's always important to kind of repeat a message sometimes that it stays with people.
Yes.
And so my question for you is, could you detail for the public what is the role of the Central Bank of Curaçao and St. Martin? What do you guys do for the island?
Yes. So as a central bank, we have four main tasks or responsibilities, if you want. The first one is to make sure that the exchange rate, the gilder between the dollars, stays stable. And that is in a way also to ensure that inflation is under control, because by keeping the exchange rate stable, it means you import the inflation of your main trading partners, in this case the United States. So that is the first main task of the central bank. The second important task is to do supervision, financial supervision, prudential supervision on financial institutions. So to make sure that if you are depositing your money at the bank, that it is safe and secure, and that if you want to extract it from the bank, it's still there. And so a third important objective and task of the central bank is to make payments possible. So if you make payment to your family member that is banking at another bank, then the settlement is occurring through the central bank, and the central bank has oversight over the payment system. And a fourth important task is to advise the government on, for example, budgetary policy, providing the agent function to the central bank, to the government. So if the Minister of Finance wants, for example, to issue a bond, we help him issue this bond. So I think that is four of the most important tasks of the central bank for Sint Maarten.
Okay. Now, one of the questions that people usually usually ask is whether or not we have a stable exchange rate. Do we have, and I ask that because, you would tend to go to different establishments, and sometimes some may take it at 1.8, 1.78, 1.77 even. So could you explain that a bit more for the public? Do we have just one exchange rate, or does it change? And what are the official rate?
Yes.
The conversion between dollar and gilder.
That's an excellent question. So the exchange rate has been stable over 50 years. So the exchange rate is 1.79 guilders to the dollar, and that has been the same over the last 50 years. But what happens, of course, is that if banks perform the transaction or the exchange, then they take a small margin to cover their cost of doing business and other things. And so what is if you would sell dollars, you would use an exchange rate of 1.78, so a little bit less. And if you would buy dollars, you would use an exchange rate of 1.82. And so there's 1 cent below the parity rate for selling, and 3 cents for buying. And the reason is that as the government of Sint Maarten, we are charging a license fee of 1% over a transaction that is buying dollars. You pay 1% license fee, and so the bank withholds this license fee, this 1%, and then gives it through the central bank to the government of Sint Maarten, and it's actually a tax that you will pay. So that creates already some, so it's buy and sell, that is a different exchange rate, but still around the parity rate of 1.79. And then sometimes I also see other exchange rates mentioned, and that is not, it's only for like larger transactions that you have to use other exchange rate. But because you have so many different ways of transacting, there's actually quite a few possibilities for which exchange rate to use, and that becomes very complicated. And so we have a matrix on our website where you can see which exchange rate should be used for which transaction.
Understood. Okay, appreciate that. And so my next question for you, speaking of exchange rates and so forth, is of course a popular topic of dollarization on St. Martin. Yeah. The central bank published its position on that. And for those who may be unaware of what that is, could you simplify it and explain why, through the research that you did and so forth, why did the central bank take the position it did on dollarization?
Yes, I need a little bit of time for that, because it's quite you need quite a bit of pros and cons to consider when you are trying to answer this question. So for a regular person, I think it would make a lot of sense that you think in St. Maarten it's already for 60% dollarized. Many transactions on the street will be in dollars, so why not just use the dollar? Because that means you have less transaction costs, because you don't need to exchange between guilders and dollars. And so that is indeed an important advantage if you would use the dollar, so a currency of another country, of a foreign country, as your legal tender. So that would be formal dollarization. Whereas at present you have informal or unofficial dollarization. But there's a few disadvantages of having the dollar as legal tender. And the most important ones are that if you would take the dollar as legal tender, there's no option for you to do monetary policy. And what monetary policy means is that you can control the liquidity in the interbank market yourself. And that is in normal situations not super important, but in, for example, crisis situations, when you need liquidity to the banks so that banks can provide loans to consumers and businesses to keep them afloat, it is very important, because if in such a crisis situation you would have a lack of dollars, that would be very much problematic for the economy. So that is one disadvantage if you would formally dollarize. Another disadvantage is that if banks run into difficulties because of a confidence crisis and they need liquidity support by the central bank, we will not be able to provide this liquidity support if we are dollarized, because then you would need a foreign currency, that is the dollars, to provide this liquidity support, and that means you would need a buffer or something of sorts, but cannot create liquidity yourself by just issuing this liquidity to the bank, printing money. And so a final, I think, disadvantage would be that you would also lose revenue as a government, because the license fee, the main cost for consumers of exchanging these guilders for dollars, is of course a revenue for the government. So if you would remove this license fee, that would lead to lower transaction costs, but it would also lead to less revenue for the government, meaning they have to raise another tax. So you have to realize, of course, that if you would abolish the license fee, sounds good, but of course the money needs to come in somewhere to the government, so some other tax will have to be raised.
Okay, because I was under the impression that, with dollarization, that would assist where our reserves are concerned, given that, let's say like during the lockdown, there was a limit on some ATMs on how much dollars you could take out. So, I thought that with dollarization, that would something like that wouldn't be an issue. But then you explained
that would become a bigger issue, if I would think.
Okay, understood. So the next thing that comes to mind is, of course, what inflation is concerned, because that is part of your supervisory task as well. Yep. How does the inflation of the dollar affect the guilder?
Yes, so almost one-on-one. And because we have a stable exchange rate, it means that the import prices will be stable in terms of the dollar-guilder exchange rate. So basically, if prices go up in the United States, so that I assume you mean dollar inflation.
Yes.
So if prices go up in the United States, that means your prices in imports go up. That means prices on the market here in St. Maarten will go up. And so in most times, because the US has a track record of stable and low inflation, this is an advantage. Because by having this stable exchange rate, you import the stable inflation from the United States. But of course, in recent months, in the corona crisis, what we have seen is because of value chain issues and because of the huge stimulus to the demand of the US government, we see a pickup in inflation actually quite rapidly in the United States. So in this present situation, this also leads to higher import prices and therefore higher inflation on St. Maarten. And of course, having incomes stable or falling it means your purchasing power as a consumer is affected, and that is of course a problem for the economy of Sint Maarten, because it also affects demand in Sint Maarten, and of course the lives and people of and incomes of people.
Mm-hmm. Okay, because I guess why that came to mind is really also considering, if that's also the case with the guilder. So if we adopted the American dollar as our official currency, I guess with the inflation of their currency, of course, naturally that would affect Sint Maarten as well. So in a sense, it's like you have no escape, no matter, because the guild is pegged to the dollar as well.
Yeah. So I would say that is neutral. So you have it now because it's pegged. If you would introduce the dollar, you would also have it. So in both cases, you have it. So when you would be able to do something about it would be if you have a flexible exchange rate. But for a small country such as Sint Maarten, this flexible exchange rate is not really going to make a big difference, because you import almost 80% of everything that you make. So basically you will always get this imported inflation.
Gotcha. One of the things that also comes to mind is, as far as Sint Maarten's position, how Sint Maarten looks to the outside world. We are aware of the FATF laws that Sint Maarten had to sign on to, and all this other stuff. But as a central bank, can you explain what is your relationship with foreign regulators, and what type of reporting do you do as well?
Yeah, so of course, partly through the Kingdom, we are a member of the International Monetary Fund. We are a member of the World Bank through the Kingdom. We are also a member of the CFATF as a government of Sint Maarten, and the central bank is a part of this. And many of the regulations concerning the fight against anti-money laundering, or the fight against hiding the proceeds of illegal activity, that is being done through these organizations. And of course the banks play an important role in this fight against money laundering, because by monitoring the transactions that are being done through the banks, and noticing the unusual transactions, that is a way this fight is being done. And so being compliant with these kind of international regulations is an important part of our job, to make sure that banks and other financial institutions that operate on Sint Maarten are being compliant with those rules.
Okay, and can you also explain how is Sint Maarten regarded on the international market? Are we on any black or gray list, and does our relationship with the Netherlands afford us any extra benefit where that's concerned?
Oh, that's a hard question for me to answer. I know the first part is easy, that we are not on a black or a grey list.
Okay.
But we have to be careful, because there's going to be an evaluation by the CFTF in 2024, and then we should prove not only that we have the regulation in order on paper, but also in practice.
Compliance.
And so it's really compliance that's going to be in the spotlight then. And so I think that is going to be a challenge. We really need to work hard in the coming years to prove our effectiveness, that we are really doing our job on that front. And of course, if you turn out positive in such an evaluation, that will put you in a bright spot, looking outward towards Sint Maarten. But of course, the other side of the coin is also true, that if you do bad and you get a bad score, that of course will affect how investors and others will look at Sint Maarten.
Okay, understood. So another thing that comes to mind is, so I do know that the banks on the island, they have to report to the central bank as far as different things are concerned. But with information, for example, in regards to whether it's money laundering and so forth, what exactly does the central bank do? How do you use that information? How do you assist in guarding our financial industry?
Yeah. No, so we don't use this information. This information is most of the time being sent to the Financial Intelligence Unit, and then this information is analyzed by the Financial Intelligence Unit, and then being sent to the Public Prosecutor Office, and then often specialized teams that use this kind of data to prosecute criminal activity. So what we do is making sure that the banks comply with the rules and regulations, so they are in a position to monitor transactions and in a position to provide this information to the authorities that deal with the prosecution of this illegal activity. So we are not a criminal investigator in that sense.
Okay. And what would you say are the main concerns of the central bank where our financial industry is concerned? I can imagine there's always room for improvement. So, in your purview, where can that change be made?
So, where we are looking at present is we see three trends that will affect the banking sector, and it's often called 3 C's. So, climate, COVID, and cyber. And so that is something that we're really looking at. So what is the impact of COVID-19 on the balance sheet of financial institutions? That is definitely something that we need to monitor and watch. We are also very interested in how banks are protecting their data. And so they use information technology systems, and of course we know that also because of COVID-19 that cyber criminals are more active trying to steal data from and ask sometimes ransomware from financial institutions. So that is something of a concern that we are following very closely, and also what banks and others are doing in this space. And finally, something a bit farther on the horizon is climate change. This is becoming more and more prominent on the agenda, both if the world is acting. So if the world would be acting, then of course the physical risk would go down, but then the transitional risk would go up, because this will impact the energy supply, this will impact energy prices, maybe energy prices go up. So how do you shield against these risks? So those are examples of priorities for us when we look at financial institutions. But the list is quite much longer, because we feel that also consumer protection is an important item where we should maybe put more attention to, but also have more responsibilities, because the legal responsibility that we have now is limited. And you mentioned already AML, CFT. So I think banking and the financial industry is in a very dynamic landscape with many things to take into consideration.
Okay, and in what way does the central bank also assist the government where advices are concerned? And would you say that along with the task of the central bank is whether is advice or motivations along the lines of economic growth or progress? So economic development overall.
Yes, there is a task. We are more advising on the macroeconomic end of this. So macroeconomic policies, that can be the stance of budgetary policy, that could be whether a certain tax should be increased or not, and this can be requested advice, but it can also be not requested. But we also just monitor the economic situation very carefully and make projections for the future. So for next year, what is the economic growth, what is inflation, and so what are other important economic parameters and how are they performing. And this helps, of course, the government to underpin their budget and make sure that the projections for revenue and expenditure are in sync with what is the economic projection.
Okay, so I guess I'd like to end off on, of course, we just came from the emerging technology event and so forth, and the central bank, was very open in hosting this seminar, let's say. Mm-hmm. So my first question for you is, what can you say as far as the progress in relation to online payment systems are concerned for Curacao and St. Martin?
Yes, so we are making good progress with the introduction of instant payment. So we are expecting to introduce instant payments beginning of next year, and that would facilitate transactions, because it would mean that if you do a transaction, it takes, I think, 8 or 10 seconds before you can see that the money is being paid to your account. And of course that also facilitates all kinds of online businesses, where you would, if you would go to a website, would make a purchase, the one that is selling you the product can see immediately whether you have paid, and can immediately close and finalize the transaction. And that would facilitate commerce in a more broader sense. So I think this is an important development. I really hope that we can be able to introduce these instant payments together with the cooperation of the banks that are working hard on this in the beginning of next year.
Okay, and on the same topic, what can you say with the central bank looking at the atmosphere, the energy, the interest as well, where fintech is concerned. What can you say for our islands as far as expectations or what persons can look out for those who are interested in I guess, establishing this industry in our islands?
Well, this is really a dynamic landscape, so it's really, I think, entrepreneurs can take advantage with that, have a technology background, to see where they can see technology to fit into their business model. So I think it is something that every basically company should take a look at, how it will change their business, how new methods of payments can change their business, how new platforms will make transactions available. I think it is comparable with what you see with Airbnb. Of course, Airbnb changed the landscape of hospitality in a quite impactful way. And so also these new payment platforms, but also new financial technology platforms can change how we do business. And so if you are an entrepreneur, I think it is good to inform yourself and see whether there is something that you need to be dealing with.
Okay. Is the central bank at any time considering minting coins as well?
Minting coins in terms of creating our own central bank digital currency?
Correct.
Well, that is certainly something that we are not doing in the short term. So we have looked at it and we've decided that we take a monitoring approach. So what we see is that the large central banks are now studying this. There's a few central banks, for example, close by in Bahamas, that have actually introduced a token. But because our interbank payment system is actually quite efficient, we don't see the added value of that so much, but it is important that we work on financial inclusion, making bank accounts available for everyone, and that is something that we pay our attention to. And for creating our own central bank digital currency, that is more something we are in the wait and see, but follow closely approach, because at some point we will definitely start to consider this very seriously.
Okay, and as far as consumer protection is related, how does the central bank assist in this regard? And consumer protection, as a term, what does that mean to the central bank, and how does it assist in that as well?
Yes, so we're not formally the code of conduct supervisor from a statutory perspective, but we do have some regulations that limit, for example, the exchange rate or the other cost that can be asked for loans. We limit also the amount of loans that a consumer could take to 37% of its annual income. And so there's a few regulations where we try to protect consumers. But I think this is something to be careful about, because with these new technologies will also come maybe risk to consumers, that they invest in certain virtual assets, for example, that actually don't have any intrinsic value or are basically based on a scam. And so it's hard to distinguish, even for a central bank, between what is intrinsically valuable because people believe in this and there is a solid business model behind, and some that is really set up to just try to fool people. And that is something that we try to monitor, but it's also something that we have to warn people, because we won't supervise them. So we won't be able to look in their books, because not all of them will be supervised, because not all of them are being seen as financial service providers that need to be supervised. So it's really something that consumers should be very much aware of, and we warn for the risks.
Okay. And for the general public, can you clarify the central bank's policy or what governs the determination for setting up a bank account? Of course, this is the usual complaint people have, that it's time-consuming. There's often too much request for information. So can you also clarify, I guess, what regulations are there that you guys have for the commercial banks that make it such a lengthy process?
Yeah, there's quite a number of regulations that we have. Mostly related to getting a good insight in what kind of transactions are taking place, because we require from banks that they do transaction monitoring, that they know their customer, that they know what is happening on the bank account. Because if there is unusual activity that is required to be reported to the authorities, then they need to be able to explain to us how they do this. And that of course causes some of the additional burden that they pass on to consumers because they have to require some information. So we're working on this, trying to simplify some of these procedures so it becomes easier to open a bank account. But it is an ongoing conversation, and we understand the frustration that there is by people because this really needs to get easier for a consumer to get a bank account.
Okay, and just two more questions for you. One of them being basically what legislations can we expect from the central bank? If I'm not mistaken, I think in the presentation it outlined or mentioned that there are these 4 legislations that we can expect.
Yes, but I don't have them readily available because there's quite a lot of actually legislation that's on the list. So in the context of the conference that we held on virtual assets and blockchain, what we are working on is legislation that will improve oversight on these new services, so that they will be required to have a adequate bookkeeping, that they will be required to have internal controls. So some measures that give some security to people that they are dealing with viable businesses.
Okay, yeah. So I guess I was going to switch it to asking then, at least for the upcoming year, what will be the focus of the central bank? Is there anything in particular that you're focused on achieving, bringing out to the public?
Yes. So. It's actually the 4 things that I mentioned earlier. So we will be focusing on climate, COVID, and cyber. Those are 4 or 3 key areas where we will be working on. And we have also published a financial sector reform program. It's on our website, and that has 5 pillars. But I guess I will be here for a long time if I explain all of that. But financial soundness of the institutions is something that is top of mind for us as well. Okay,
and then finally. One of the also concern of the public that usually makes discussion on the island is the conversations of interest rates and whether or not it can be lowered. Because of course, if you look at various other countries, you see where they may have interest rates close to 0, 1, 2%, and St. Martin, with some banks stating that they do have quite a lot of cash and so forth. You ask yourself then, can we and the public on St. Martin expect lower interest rates as well? And I guess to what extent does the central bank determine what that number should be?
Mm-hmm. No, because we have a fixed exchange rate with the United States, our interest rate is very much aligned with the interest rate of the United States. But there's only a markup because we are a smaller market, and so that's one reason. So the scale is smaller, and that means that there's probably going to be a higher cost of funding for the banks. And the second reason why interest rates are high is credit risks are being seen as higher in St. Martin than in other jurisdictions, and that has to do with enforcing loans, with the high debt level of consumers and businesses, and reasons such as those. And so the interest rate development in St. Martin will be aligned with the interest rate that you will see in the United States, but it will always be a little bit higher than this.
Okay, understood. Well, thank you so much, sir.
No, thank you. My pleasure.
Any other thing you'd like to add?
No, thank you very much for your questions and your time, and I wish you a pleasant day.
Okay. Much appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, everyone. So that was my interview with Mr. Richard Doornbosch, President of the Central Bank of Curaçao and St. Martin. And be sure to tune in tomorrow, because this week we have quite an interesting lineup for you with some different leaders in the business and political sector, and some highlights of our young professionals as well. So thank you for listening to the news behind the news today, and take care.